I'm sure you've heard somebody when referencing food say, I would kill for this or I would die for that, but these are just figments of speech. Nobody would actually kill another person for a Pop-Tart. However, there are some foods that find their history and their origins in actual bloody carnage. One such food is that of mayonnaise. That's right, it is the condiment that people either love or they hate with a very strong passion. I've never found anybody who was just lukewarm about it. But mayonnaise and its origins come from a rather bloody aftermath of a siege of a small island off of the coast of Spain, and we're going to talk about that right now. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Double D, where we are exploring historical weirdos and culinary concoctions. Our story starts on a small island off the coast of Spain called Minorca. Now this is Minorca now, and it is absolutely gorgeous. It also boasts the second largest port in the entire world, which is called Mahon or Mahon. Now this once gorgeous island was once home to a historical naval battle and a gridlock between different countries trying to fight for it. Now, obviously, you have the Spanish right off the coast. However, the Spanish is kind of a third-party player in this, at least at this point in time. Our main characters in this are going to be the English and the French. Now, this was during the 1750s or the 1740s leading up to the 1750s, and this was part of the 7 Years' War. But let's face it, the English and the French, they're not buds, and they have been fighting in the 100 Years' War and the 7 Years' War and in every other obscure number that you can put blah, blah, blah years war, they have fought in. And at the time of their battle, they looked at this beautiful island and said, you know what? This is a wonderful port and a wonderful staging ground for us to actually launch our ships and to stage attacks from. At the time, the British had control of the island of Minorca and had the majority of their troops in a fort. And the fort was called the Fort St. Phillip. And at that time, there were around 2,860 individuals that were actually stationed there under British command. Now, there's two main individuals that you need to know about on the French side. One of their names is Duc de la Richelieu, and the other one is Roland Michel Baron de la Glacioniere. And those are the two French individuals that actually led the way of the siege of Fort St. Philip. Now, the closest British occupied territory to Minorca at that time was Gibraltar. Gibraltar is located in South Spain. And at that time, even in Gibraltar, they were heavily undermanned and did not have the ability to respond to the siege of Fort St. Philip in the island of Minorca. Led on by an entire fleet of French vessels, the French were able to get over 1,000 ships and transport over 16,000 French soldiers to the island of Minorca to immediately lay siege on Fort St. Philip. In response to this, we bring in our second character, who is going to be the main hero of the British people, and his name is Admiral John Byng. John Byng was a very well decorated individual and even a member of Parliament at the time, proving himself over and over again. So when the English heard what was going on with the siege of Fort St. Philip and the fact that the French were moving on Minorca, they said, oh shoot, this isn't good. Let's send one of our best individuals to Gibraltar to get all the supplies that he needs and then sail straight from Minorca to kick the French out of our island. And that sounds great on paper, but it wasn't that great in practice. So at the current time, they were much more focused on protecting England than they actually were in trying to protect any of its assets. And so they had 12 man-of-war ships that were currently stationed around England for protection in case there was a French invasion. And Lord George Anson, who was the head of Admiralty, did not want to give up any resources whatsoever in order to help Admiral John Byng in taking back Minorca from the French. This is kind of like an individual who's in the hospital and needs an open heart surgery and maybe even a transplant, and the doctors ring up the insurance company and say, hey, we're going to need a new heart, and they come at you and say, we'll give you like 2 aspirin. You take a second, you say, wait a second, I think the message was miscommunicated, and they go, nope, we heard what you said, we're just going to give you nothing. Obviously, John Byng didn't like this, but it wasn't like he had much of a choice. So what he did was, with no money and no time and no effort and no nothing, he decided to go to Gibraltar and basically find his ships. Now, when he went to finally outfit his ships, 3 out of the 10 of them were not even there, and the remaining 7, half of them had huge problems. For instance, one of them was actually missing a mast, which is kind of an important feature. He was also short a whopping 800 men, so not only was he outgunned and outshipped, if that's a word, which I'm sure it's not, he was also outmanned. And by the time that he showed up, yes, the British were holding out in Fort St. Philip, but the French had totally made a blockade. So instead of getting sailors, he was able to actually find fusiliers. And what fusiliers are is infantrymen. They're not sailors. They might have never been on a ship other than through transportation. So he had these ships which were basically outgunned and perhaps didn't even have half the cannons they were supposed to, with individuals sailing them that had never sailed as sailors before. What could go wrong? Now, when he got to Gibraltar, he asked General Thomas Folk, who was in command there, and they held a war council. John Byng requested that General Thomas Folk give him resources, give him ships, give him people, something. And General Thomas Folk said, absolutely not. You're all crazy. I'm not giving you my Marines, and bye. And this is partly because Gibraltar was absolutely being held together by toothpicks, duct tape, and good wishes. They were in no way able to give this kind of help to begin with. Admiral Byng basically said, well, this is going to suck, but we're going to have to do it anyways, and sailed towards Minorca. But just as you've seen any sports movie where the underdog team comes in and gets into a huddle and they go, okay, we're going to get them even though they're all bigger and stronger and smarter than you, we're going to do it, and somehow they manage to pull out the upset victory. This didn't happen. It did not happen this way for Admiral Byng. Now, he had the weather gauge. He knew the weather. In fact, he had the advantage in the weather and the approach. However, his plan totally went awry. And his plan was quite simple. The ships on the bay were blocking the port, and so they were all lined up in a straight row. What Admiral Byng was going to do was he was going to bring his ships into basically a straight line as well, but at a certain point of time, he was going to turn those ships, and this turn in unison with the wind behind them certainly would give them the advantage. And that's exactly what they attempted to do. Now, I say attempted because it absolutely failed. There was a captain on the lead ship called the Defiance, and what was going to happen was he was going to lead the way, and at a certain point in time, all the ships were going to turn in unison to face the French and be able to respond accordingly and catch them off guard. However, this captain had no idea what the plan was, and actually just continued sailing. And so you had a French row of ships, and then you had a British row of ships, and instead of actually engaging the enemies, the ships just kept going. They probably even waved as they passed them by. Now, Admiral Byng was in a ship called the Ramillies, and when he saw that this first ship was doing this, and roughly half of the ships followed in suit doing the exact same thing, passing right on by, going straight, he started firing. It doesn't say where he fired. He might have even fired at the lead ship. He was trying to get their attention. It took some 10 or 15 minutes for the lead ship to be like, oh shoot, yeah, we actually had a plan. We weren't just sailing and doing nothing. And so he finally came about, and the plan started going into action. Meanwhile, the French were on their vessels, kicking up their feet with popcorn, saying, would you look at these idiots? They clearly have no idea what they're doing, and they're makeshift ships being held together with duct tape. Now, obviously, at that time that they finally did turn around, the French had watch the entire thing. There was absolutely no element of surprise. The wind was not at the British soldiers' back anymore, and so the French just opened fire. Because of his line being upset, it would be 30 to 40 minutes before they could actually reform the line at Admiral Byng, but they did finally pull away once the onslaught of French fire came in, and they stayed there for roughly 4 to 4.5 hours, basically just staring at the French ships that just kicked their butts. Because of this, Admiral Byng decided to sail off to be somewhat close to Minorca, but away from the French, and this is where he stayed for around 4 to 5 days, just kind of pondering life and wondering what to do, and I guess the solution never came to him, because at the conclusion of this bewilderment, he decided that he was going to sail back to Gibraltar to repair his ships. Now, the problem with this is that you had almost 3,000 troops in Fort St. Phillip who were counting and waiting on the cavalry to come in and save them. Because Admiral Byng just continued to sail off, he left all those soldiers stranded, and the island fell very soon thereafter. Now, Admiral Byng had plans to repair his ships at Gibraltar and give it another good go, but before he could do that, a ship came in ordering him and General Folk and a couple of other captains and seniors back to England, and when you get ordered back to England and not requested, it's usually not for good things. As soon as he returned to England, Admiral Byng was arrested and placed into custody. See, what England did was, in order to sort of motivate and to keep people encouraged to fight and fight hard, their parliament passed something that said that individuals would be court-martialed if they did not do everything in their power to resist or to enforce the goals and the desires of Britain. And this obviously was the case with Admiral Byng. Instead of fighting, he basically gave a half-hearted effort and then sailed back to Gibraltar. General Foch, who refused to give him Marines from Gibraltar, was also court-martialed and relieved of his duty. At that time, there was a mandatory sentence if you were court-martialed for this charge, and that mandatory court sentence was death. See, they wanted to make an example out of John Byng to make sure that other individuals gave their utmost against the enemy. So Admiral Byng was detained on the HMS Monarch, and on the 14th of March 1757, at the age of 52, he was taken to the quarterdeck for execution in the presence of all the men from the other ships. He knelt on a cushion and signified his readiness for execution by dropping his handkerchief, and at that point in time, a group of Marines shot him on the quarterdeck until he was no longer living. A good way to summarize this entire thing is from a 1759 novella written by a philosopher named Voltaire. Voltaire actually witnessed the event and said in his novella that in this country it is good to kill an admiral from time to time in order to encourage the others. Unfortunately, John Byng was that individual. Now, what do you do when you win a giant naval battle? Obviously, you celebrate with a huge meal. I don't know if any of you have any experience in French cooking, but the French love their sauces. They love their sauces perhaps more than life itself. And so whenever they were preparing this feast, they wanted a nice sauce to accompany the lamb or whatever it is that they were having with it. Now, remember when we introduced the Duke of Richelieu? He had his chef preparing him a banquet. And let's face it, we're on an island at that point in time, possibly wasn't entirely populated with cattle. We don't know the exact circumstances, but there was no cream on the island to go into this banquet. And so what the French chef decided to do was substitute that cream and put in oil. To make the sauce, he used olive oil, and he used eggs as a base, or egg yolk, and then he also put in some sort of acid. And at the time it was probably vinegar, but it also could have been lemon juice as well. And boom, there's your sauce. It was called Mahonesa or Mahonesa, dedicated to the port of Mahon or Mahon, part of Minorca, the area that they captured, the entire prize of Minorca itself. Over time, this sauce later became adapted to mayonnaise, which kind of took on more of a French connotation than anything else. Thus, for the inception of Mahonesa, later mayonnaise, we first had to have an incredibly bloody battle, first in the siege of Fort St. Phillip, and then in our naval battle that cost Admiral Byng his life, along with a lot of other people. So was it worth it to sacrifice all those bodies for mayonnaise? Yes, maybe. I don't know. No? I don't know what the right answer is for that. This is what I'm going to show you right now, the traditional way of how to make Mahonesa. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to get a bowl, preferably a bowl that doesn't clank, crack, and all of these other things that a glass bowl will do. But hey, you know what? Beggars can't be choosers. So we're just going to grab a bowl. We're going to first start with our eggs. It's not exactly clear on whether he used the yolks and the entirety of the egg or whether he just used the yolks. So what we're going to do is we're just going to use the yolks. This is more of a thought of a traditional way. You can use the entirety of the egg, but I believe the traditional way is just yolk. That's at least everything that I could find, but you can do it both ways. So we're just going to put in our egg yolk, and essentially what we're doing is just mixing in the oil. Now we have olive oil. Why olive oil? Because this is the traditional way of doing it. I would never use olive oil to make mayonnaise now, and olive oil is almost never used to make mayonnaise unless, of course, it says made with olive oil. But the reason why is that olive oil is not a neutral oil. It's going to taste and smell like olives. So if you don't like olives but you like mayonnaise, it's because they were not using olive oil. And so traditionally you sort of have a canola oil or vegetable oil. This is what you would make, safflower oil, but we're going to do it the traditional way with putting in the olive oil. The biggest trick to making mayonnaise is that you cannot put in the oil too fast or too much of it all at once. What it's going to do is basically just become an oily, gross mess. And so you have to emulsify the egg, put in the oil little by little, and then keep that consistency going. You're looking for a bit of a creaminess or a sauce-like texture. Bear in mind, because this is an oil, it will emulsify a little bit and harden up whenever it becomes cold, which is why they always say, for other reasons as well because of the egg, but this is why they always say to refrigerate the mayonnaise, because when you refrigerate oil, it becomes much more gelatinous, and if you heat it up, it's just going to melt into a puddle. This is why you can use things like mayonnaise instead of butter. Just going to hit it with a little salt, and then we're going to hit it with a little acid. Now this is totally up to you on what kind of acid you want. So we're just going to do this until we have our desired consistency and our desired amount. Only once the French were able to capture the island, losing 3,000 to 4,000 troops and however many locals were killed in the process, was this condiment even conceptualized and able to be made. Like I said, not only was it the murderous and the brutality of the event, but it was only made based on the fact that they ran out of cream, which is another instance of just how food can contextualize and bring to life history in a way that has never been told before. Now, you won't see that on the back of a Duke's mayonnaise jar, I can just about guarantee it. They like to make it seem like there was no death or brutality or destruction or murder that went into any of their sauces, and I'm sure that won't change anytime soon. Thank you for watching this episode of Double D. We are coming at you next time with more great historical culinary concoctions and weird events. Hopefully you learned a thing or two. Go out there and impress somebody by telling them, hey, you know that someone had to kill for that mayonnaise, and just see what your friends say and the crazy looks they give you. In fact, better yet, bring it up at the dinner table. The next time somebody tries to use mayonnaise in front of you, you set the record straight. I'll see you on the next video. Until then, take care and be well.